New polling shows near record low support for handgun bans. Plus, the gender gap in gun ownership shrinks. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. TheReload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today to sign up for our free weekly newsletter to keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of guns. To kick us off this week, we actually had a couple of big polls from Gallup. And one of the first kind of relates to the past presidential election because it found that support for a handgun ban, particularly among Democrats, is way down.
Yeah, Gallup dropped a bunch of new gun polling and research, even long-term research, immediately after the election was over. I don't know why they didn't do it beforehand. This poll, the first one we're talking about here, came from October, from actually like early October. So I'm not sure why they waited. But yeah, one of the interesting results is that support for a handgun ban, and this is a ban on like possession of handguns. And the question basically is like, should only police be allowed to have handguns? And that has fallen back down to a near record low. It's 1 point off the record low. So it's at about 20 points. 20% of Americans support the idea of a handgun ban. A couple of years ago, it was 19%. But then it ticked up for a little while, primarily because Democrats started to get more on board with the idea. And in fact, the last time they did this poll, which was only a year ago, Democrats were at 49% support. So pretty huge reversal on that front the last couple of years. And then now another huge reversal on the part of Democrats in this poll because their support dropped significantly over the course of the last year, especially in the very late lead up to the actual election itself. And I think it's pretty fair to say that that was probably because of the way that Kamala Harris ran on guns, where her main message, at least rhetorically, right, what she kept talking about, was that she owns a gun. She owns a handgun, a Glock. And so I would not be at all surprised if that is why Democrats came back around to the idea of owning handguns, or at least not banning them, because their candidate for president was very publicly talking about how she personally owns one for self-defense. So that's a pretty interesting finding. I mean, both in that handgun ban is back near record lows, especially if you look, like Gallup's been asking that question for forever, since the 1950s. And it used to be a very popular proposition to ban handguns in the United States, according to Gallup. You're talking about like 60+% support early on, and then now it's just basically a fringe idea at this point. So I don't know, kind of the most fascinating thing to come out of that first poll that Gallup released, I think. And there are a few other things, right? It wasn't just the handgun ban.
Yeah, they asked a series of kind of gun policy related questions. Another sort of policy position that we saw at least a modest decline in support for was for an assault weapons ban. Although I think we have to, of course, caveat this a little bit just because Gallup worded this question in a way that not a lot of other pollsters do. If you want to, I know you mentioned this in your piece.
This is a common problem you have throughout the media, and including with pollsters in particular, is just a lack of understanding of terms and policies that they're asking about, which I think in turn is shared by a lot of people who are answering these polls too. But basically Gallup frames this as though it's an assault weapons ban question, right? And assault weapons, we've talked about this a lot before on the show. That term is it's a political, a statutory term in some states, but it's sort of a nebulous term, right? Because different states have different definitions of what an assault weapon is in their assault weapons bans, and they differ from the expired federal assault weapons ban, right? And generally speaking, assault weapon will be defined as a center fire rifle or firearm that is semi-automatic and can accept detachable magazines, and then includes either one or two banned features. So that's why you'll hear the term featureless rifle, because that'll get around assault weapons bans. But basically, the features tend to be pistol grips, barrel shrouds, telescoping stocks, grenade launchers, for whatever reason, is a common one. Basically, there was a list that was put together in the 90s for the assault weapons ban at the federal level, and that got picked up a lot. But since the 90s, places like California or Massachusetts have been continually updating their assault weapons bans. So what an assault weapon was in California in 1998 is very different from what it is today. And so anyway, but you get the idea here. That's what an assault weapon is. And that's what I think it's clear that that's what Gallup is trying to ask about. But the way they ask it, first off, they're asking about a pretty different policy from what usually gets floated. Because usually assault weapons bans are a ban on future sales of the affected guns, not on their possession. Although sometimes it will be extended to buybacks. Kamala Harris, for instance, supported a mandatory buyback of so-called assault weapons in 2019 before she ran for president, when she was running for president then, and then walked back that support in this latest campaign. But usually most proposals are a ban on sales. Gallup's asking about a ban on possession too. So they're asking about like a confiscation measure here, which is obviously more severe policy than just a sales ban with grandfathering and things like that. But they ask specifically about, quote, semi-automatic guns, often referred to as assault rifles. Assault rifle is is a specific term. It's a technical term for a certain type of military weapon. Now, this gets pretty confusing, I think, for most people pretty fast, because assault rifles, generally speaking, are similar in nature to a lot of what tend to be targeted by assault weapons bans. And people will often use these terms interchangeably, even though they're not really interchangeable, because an assault rifle, term that comes from the German Sturmgewehr, which means storm or assault rifle, was the first of this sort of class of firearms, which are rifles capable of select fire, so both semi-automatic and fully automatic fire, that fire an intermediate cartridge. So this is a cartridge that's somewhere between a pistol caliber and a full battle rifle caliber. So your 5.56, your 7.62, those rounds, and it is designed for a certain type of warfare, small squad maneuvering. Regardless, basically, we're talking about M16s, AK-47s, and then assault weapons are usually, generally speaking, targeting their sort of civilian semi-automatic only counterparts, AR-15s, AK-47s that are more widely available to American civilians. So all that to say that Gallup's poll, the way they asked this question is pretty shaky. But regardless, interestingly, you still get a pretty similar result as what a lot of other pollsters get when they ask in different ways about this same concept. These are sort of, it's almost like a vibes poll. It's sort of a question of, do you think AR-15 should be banned or not? And so one of the interesting takeaways, whether you like the wording or not, and this is a common thing that, I talk about in these pieces, like there are things to critique about these polls. And, the wording is clearly one of them, but they've been using that wording forever. So you can at least get a trend line. Is support for this thing that they're asking about, whether or not they're asking in a way that makes the most sense. Is it going up or down? And in this case, it's going down. I think it's 56%. In the most recent poll.
Yeah. 52, actually, I think.
52, right?
Yeah. Down about 9 points over the last 5 years.
Yeah. So it's been on the decline, which is maybe not the most surprising thing at this moment in time. Because again, as we've talked about a number of times in the show at this point, this year has not seen a lot of mass shootings. And the wake of mass shootings is when you tend to see support for these sorts of policies increase.
Right.
And you can see it in these Gallup polls, in the trend lines over the years. It's pretty clear when they're spiking is right around when there was a major mass shooting. And then they drop back down after that. So, but, it gives you something. It's not perfect polling.
Right.
The questioning is not perfect, but you can still take something away from it. They still are using scientific methods to, find a representative sample of Americans to give you, a degree of certainty on that this is reflective of public sentiment and whether or not the question is asked properly or whether people might respond differently to a differently worded question is certainly open for debate. But you at least get you can take something away from the trend here, which is that there's a decrease in support for whatever you would describe what Gallup is asking about. Right.
There's also a modest decrease in support for just stricter gun laws overall. That's at about 56%, according to this poll.
Yeah, that was 56%. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you're seeing sort of this, like you said, I think it probably has to do a little bit with the fact that there just hasn't been the crime, or at least murder is down. There hasn't been a ton of high profile mass shootings. And so you kind of see that a waning of the previous spikes after past mass shootings. But there is a bit of a caveat in sort of that stricter gun laws question that I think is worth pointing out, right? I know we were talking about this before we jumped on, and that's, while support for stricter gun laws is down, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a groundswell of support for liberalization of gun laws. Is that right?
Yeah. And that's something that I think doesn't get maybe enough attention, especially in the gun rights side of things. A lot of gun rights activists want to see looser gun laws. And perhaps if you ask people specific questions about a specific policy, you may get a very different response, right? I think that's always the case. But in general, there is not a lot of support in the United States for loosening gun laws. Again, this is sort of a vibes question. Do you think gun laws should be stricter or kept as they are or less strict? And they're not asking people about specific policy ideas or what have you. But, and of course, opinion polls are not necessarily how you determine what gun laws should be, because there's obviously other more significant considerations like constitutional rights protections that go into the conversation. But one thing that gets overlooked is that most people just don't think that our gun laws should be looser on a general scale. And in fact, looking at this polling, it's clear, and it really doesn't change much over time. I think the record high since 1990 in this Gallup poll was 14% said they should be less strict, whereas the record low was like 2% in 1990. So, it fluctuates a little bit, but it really doesn't ever get beyond 15% support. And sometimes there's almost nobody who thinks that the law should be less strict. So, just to be clear on what the breakdown of that is. And, we talk about the handgun ban as something that is extremely unpopular, that the concept of banning handguns has become, almost a fringe idea. Well, it's about twice as popular as the idea that gun laws should be less strict. So it's just something to keep in mind. It doesn't, I don't think it has a major impact on specific policy pursuits or reforms that people want to see in how federal and state governments deal with guns. But it's just a sort of reality that needs to be discussed, right? These are not, there's not a super, most people do not think that our gun laws are too strict.
Right. No, it's a good point. Elsewhere in Gallup's polling this week, we had another interesting write-up that they did looking at sort of the changes in the gender gap of gun ownership. So traditionally, it's been a very male skewing act to own a gun, but Gallup is actually uncovering that over the years, it's become less polarized along gender lines, but increasingly polarized along partisan lines. And you wrote up some of those findings.
Yeah, it's interesting to see this because for a very long time, the gender gap was much more significant than the partisan gap. But now that's flipped and driven mainly by Republican women buying guns, or at least reporting that they own a gun to Gallup, and Democrat and independent men doing the opposite. So, it's a more significant divide now on whether you own a gun based on your party affiliation than your gender, which is sort of a remarkable turnaround. It actually, from what Gallup was saying in their polling, they looked at 3 different periods of time going back to 2007, and partisan breakdown didn't used to be a major differentiator when it came to gun ownership back in like 2007, not like one of the major factors. And now it is. So on the one hand, the gender gap getting smaller, puts people in theory on a closer scale of how they viewed firearms. But if the reason that the gender gap is closing is because the partisan gap has expanded, I think overall you're probably looking at a situation where the long-term trends are pretty precarious for gun rights, because the more polarized the issue becomes, the more polarized gun laws are going to become. And we've obviously seen this happening in real time as deep blue states and deep red states have wildly different gun regulations, right? Obviously the Constitution, the federal Constitution, keeps some level of some base level of gun rights in place across the country, but you can look at any blue state compared to any red state and see that there's quite a lot of variation. And the big problem for this is if it's increasingly partisan, this idea that people should be able to own guns or should want to own guns, then it's increasingly likely, as the government flips between Republicans and Democrats over time, that the gun laws could swing significantly in that period at the federal level, and certainly at the state level as well. So it's kind of a polarization is not what if you're interested in a particular issue, what you would like to see, and we've talked about this on the show before, I think we talked about with Cam Edwards a little while back, but you want to see both parties embracing your position. If you're interested in the long-term prosperity of your particular issue. And so if you're a gun rights advocate, you would much rather see Democrats coming around to your point of view than having to constantly fight with them over it. And, obviously there's not, as I discussed before, it's not like it's a push-pull thing, I think, from what I've seen. Like it's not so much that gun owners or the gun rights movement are pushing Democrats away only. Polarization has taken hold and Democrats have moved away as well. Like you see both. I think look at the way that the NRA, for instance, has dealt with Democrats over the years. Fewer Democrats are winning, A ratings from the NRA, and that's partially because fewer Democrats are trying to get an A rating from the NRA, but it's also probably partially because the NRA has become extremely connected to the Republican Party, almost exclusively. And if you go to any Trump NRA event, it's intentional. It's partial, to some degree. They're definitely diving into that connection. So I don't know. It's just a worrying trend, I think, in the long term if you're a gun rights advocate, because it's very unlikely that Republicans will control the federal government forever.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, it's just that's
just not the way our system's set up.
Generally speaking, that doesn't happen.
Right.
So even if you have a period of time where your party does well, eventually the other party is going to get back in control. I mean, we've now gone Democrat, Republican as far as federal, as far as the presidency goes. And there's good reason to think that could happen again in 4 years, or that Democrats will control one house of Congress in 2 years. We can't know any of this, but it's certainly a pretty good chance that could happen. So the further away Democrats are from gun owners and gun rights advocates, the more risk there is that gun policy swings against those groups as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And some of it, like you said, I think the push-pull factor is important to emphasize, because it isn't just a one-way street kind of a thing. We've seen this broad sort of alignment between the two parties sort of on this issue and other issues. It's not just guns that this has been the case, but yeah, this kind of has become sort of the inevitable results where you're seeing it more polarized on party lines increasingly so. So I think that does have implications for our increasingly chaotic swings in power at the federal level and what that means for gun messaging and the feasibility of gun legislation going forward. So I think that will be the story. And
look, I mean, the NRA did endorse one Democrat this year, and they lost.
Yeah. And she lost. Yep.
She lost. So I don't know. It's not like there's some easy fix where the NRA or somebody can just start going out and endorsing a bunch of Democrats. There's just not a lot of them out there who even want an NRA endorsement anymore.
Right.
And it's like I said, it's not just the NRA, wholeheartedly embracing Donald Trump or something like that. That's part of it. Or Republicans generally, not just Donald Trump, but there is also just a movement away from gun rights groups by Democrats and towards stricter gun laws, and apparently a movement away from even owning guns by your rank and file Democrats. So, although there is reason to think maybe Gallup's polling, it is just one poll. Gallup is obviously a well-respected pollster. But some of what they're finding in this poll, it does go against what we've seen, and in interesting ways. And it's not clear who exactly is right. One, just to get into some of the nuance here, or some caveats. One, and this is not just a potential critique of Gallup or potential concern for their polling, but we did have a study a couple of years ago that found gun owners are very reluctant to tell pollsters and researchers that they own firearms. There's certainly a segment of gun owners who won't talk to pollsters or researchers. We did a whole podcast on that actually at the time with the researcher who conducted the study, but basically they put together a series of indicators that would imply that somebody probably owns a gun. And then they tried to ask those people if they own guns. And they found that quite a lot of people who they believed owned guns would not say that they did. Now, it's hard to estimate how many people you're sort of known unknowns, I guess you might call them. But they said it's something like 45% of people who owned a gun, who they thought probably owned a gun, didn't report owning a gun to them. And so there's some reason to think that maybe the number of people who own firearms is being undercounted. And it's not just like an anecdotal, I believe this because I know people who don't talk to pollsters and they don't go, whatever. Like, it's not just anecdotal. There is some scientific research to back up this concept. Now, again, that still goes back to this trend line. Like, presumably that's always been an issue. Maybe it's an increasing issue. We're not sure, but you can still get some idea from the trend line data. I think you can still take away some valuable information from that. But and then the other interesting bit from this Gallup polling, especially on gun ownership rate, is that it contradicts or conflicts with some of the other data we've seen in the post-pandemic era that indicates there was an increase in gun ownership. Gallup's saying basically that there wasn't an increase, that things have been pretty much stable since 2007, at least, right? In this polling, they say there's about 31% of Americans report being gun owners when asked. And then another, I think it was 13% reported having a gun in the home, even though I guess they didn't consider themselves to be gun owners, right? So that number, 44%, is not that far off what some of the other polling has found. Like the AP, I think, had the number at 46% when they did their post-pandemic poll on gun ownership. But that was a significant increase from previous polls. So that, they found that gun ownership had ticked up, whereas Gallup found it really didn't. And so we're not really sure. Obviously, we had industry surveys that indicated millions of people bought guns for the first time during the pandemic, and you saw record gun sales levels, or record, at least, background checks on gun sales, right? That's how we tend to measure them. But and there were some other studies in California, for instance, which has a gun registry, so you can get a little clearer view of whether new people were buying guns. And there was I recall a study from immediately after the pandemic, I think 2022, that found there was an increase in first-time buyers in California, and there's a couple million new buyers in California. So, this Gallup polling goes against a bit of that. There's also the NBC News poll. We had one of the pollsters who did that on the show a while back. I think it was a year or two ago, and they found that gun ownership among voters, which is a bit different, right? It's not just all Americans, but voters, was at a record high, and that there had actually been a significant increase, I think 10 plus point increase over 5 years in that polling. So we're kind of getting a bit of a mixed messaging from these polls. Some of them say, gun ownership rate has remained relatively stable over really the last 15 plus years. And some of them say we did see a significant increase around the pandemic. And so it's not entirely clear which one's right. And I think that has also a lot of implications down the line, right? If there are millions of new gun owners, that implies that perhaps, even if only a small percentage of them become politically active, you could see changes to our gun politics. And you could even perhaps point to Kamala Harris and how she ran at least the messaging of her campaign on guns. She didn't really change policy proposals, but she certainly messaged very differently from how Democrats normally message on guns, right? She's talking about her Glock, and she's going to shoot somebody who comes into her house, breaks into her house, whatever. Maybe that's part of the effect. But, if there are a lot more gun owners, and especially if they come from demographics that don't traditionally own guns at high rates, like minorities and women, then presumably there will, at some point down the line, be an impact on politics. It may start at this lower level, local elections or primaries, especially Democratic primaries, you would think. But eventually that would have an impact. However, if there wasn't a huge change in the makeup of gun owners or the number of them, the percentage, then, that impact would be a lot smaller, you would think. I mean, the Gallup does show a change in the makeup, right? There's more women owning guns, but it doesn't show a change in the overall number, the overall percentage of people owning guns. And that's where that would imply a much less significant political movement off the back of pandemic gun sales than maybe we previously thought. And so it's not clear, I think, is the bottom line, that there's some indicators that there was a big surge in new gun ownership, especially among people who haven't traditionally owned guns at a high rate. And now there's, at the same time, there's some evidence that there wasn't a huge surge, or at least not a statistically noticeable one when you're talking about, on the scale of national gun ownership, which is pretty big. I mean, 44% of the country is, over what, 150 million people. So, you'd need to have significant number of new gun owners to move that overall number even a little bit, just because of the sheer scale of how many people already own guns. But yeah, just something to think about another thing that came to mind when reading these results from Gallup.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just sort of speaks to the limitations of polling, and it's not. There's all sorts of caveats, but it's at the same time, it's the best we can hope for when we're trying to measure these sorts of things. So
it's better than anecdotes, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's basically the nature.
It's not perfect, but I think it does provide a little more insight than just talking to your friends at the gun store counter, as fun as that can be.
Right.
It is a good time to have. I like hanging out at the gun store and checking out the new guns, and talking to people too. But yeah, hopefully Gallup is giving us a little more scientific insight than that. But again, with limitations, there's just like the margin of error in these polls is still 4% or whatever. That's normal, but it shifts things. Like the election itself, most of the polls had, the results were within the margin of error. We're seeing like a 1.5 point, I think, win for Trump. We still don't have all the votes counted because some places like California just want to take forever to do that. But most of those polls weren't off, even if they had Harris slightly ahead. The margin of error brings things back to where that's why every serious polling analyst was saying it's a toss up. We don't really know, and it could break either way, and it broke for Donald Trump. Anyway, what's our next story? We got two state cases, right? I say
beyond polling, the theme of the week is state Supreme Court rulings, because we had a big one out of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, sort of a long awaited ruling over this novel lawsuit by the city of Philadelphia and a handful of gun control groups to attack state preemption in a new way. They actually filed suit to basically accuse Pennsylvania's preemption regime, which states that localities cannot pass gun laws that are stricter than the states, by basically saying it's unconstitutional and it unconstitutionally deprives them of their right to life and liberty because it doesn't allow local governments to pass strict gun laws. And the Democratic
substantive due process, right, is the claim.
Is the legal theory that they tried to advance this through. And the Democratic-leaning Pennsylvania Supreme Court unanimously said that was wrong and not going to fly. So state preemption is upheld.
Pretty far out there concept, I think, this time. Now, Philadelphia is always doing this stuff. They're constantly trying to break state preemption. They constantly try to institute their own gun laws, their own, for instance, concealed carry permit processing rules that violate state law. And they're constantly losing these cases in state court. They keep some pro-gun lawyers employed for sure out there, I guess. But this was their biggest swing yet, I think, and it was a total whiff as far as the outcome goes. Because this Pennsylvania Supreme Court, they elect justices in Pennsylvania, and they run in partisan elections. Like there's Democrats and Republicans. And right now the court in Pennsylvania is made up of 5 Democrats and 2 Republicans. And so to get a unanimous rejection of Philadelphia's attempt to institute new gun restrictions from a court with that breakdown is pretty significant. Now, again, it's not this isn't this Pennsylvania Supreme Court saying we don't like more gun restrictions or something. This is them saying this legal theory doesn't hold water. It doesn't make any sense. Claiming that substantive due process requires that Philadelphia be allowed to make its own gun laws was just too much for them. But I think this one will be a bit further reaching than the next one, just because it deals with preemption, which is something that like 40 states have. And Philadelphia tends to be one of the places where they try to do test cases like this to try and find something that'll stick to the wall that they can take to other states and replicate. And, they failed to do that again here. So pretty big outcome.
Yeah, I think that is the big takeaway is just what it says about the potential for other states to replicate the strategy. And it doesn't really look like that's going to fly. Yeah,
it goes well beyond Pennsylvania, I think, the implications of it.
But the other state Supreme Court ruling we have is out of Iowa, because we had our first test case of the ballot measure that we talked about 2 years ago. In 2022, voters in Iowa overwhelmingly approved a state constitutional amendment that codified a individual right to bear arms. But it also said that any infringement on that right would be subject to strict scrutiny. And so this was something that gun rights advocates had long hoped for. This is sort of a pre-Bruin artifact of the gun rights movement. The NRA was pushing for these in states across the country. I think Missouri, Louisiana, a handful of other states passed them as well, pre-Bruin. But in this case, someone was suing to get their gun rights back after they were involuntarily committed as a teenager. They were denied a concealed carry permit, and so they tried to get their rights restored. And they challenged their denial of that right under this strict scrutiny standard. And the first test case results show that, in fact, strict scrutiny does not mean that a gun rights challenge automatically wins, because the state Supreme Court case, in this case, upheld Iowa's current regime.
Yeah. We'll say that this was a 4-3 ruling instead of
it was split.
A 6-0. But so there was some question here. But at the same time, there was also some extenuating circumstances too. I believe the plaintiff had lied about his mental health history during the process of trying to obtain his license. So it wasn't, there were some extra factors involved. But it just goes to show that even under strict scrutiny, which is widely viewed as one of the strictest standards you can apply to any sort of law. It's often comes up in the context of First Amendment federal cases, but obviously the standard that gun rights advocates want for any of these sort of gun cases. But even under it, there are still viable gun restrictions that remain, because you just have to show that there's a compelling government interest, and then that the law is narrowly tailored to meet that interest. And so it's not impossible to do that. It's just very hard.
Right. But in cases like this, like you said, it can be cleared. And I think that's just important to note, because you even hear gun rights advocates still today that are unhappy with courts that uphold laws under Bruin and say, oh, we should have just done strict scrutiny instead of this Texas tradition. But it still can come out the same way. And the court doesn't really like this levels of scrutiny anymore. The Supreme Court. Right. Generally speaking. Yeah. They rejected it in Bruin. They didn't like the idea of interest balancing. So it's called. That's what the scrutiny levels are. So I don't see this obviously making its way to the Supreme Court anytime soon, but it is interesting to see how it's played out in states that have adopted it. And it just sort of goes against what people might assume would happen a little bit. Absolutely. Getting into some of our newsletter links for the week. We had one out of the Legal Intelligencer talking about a Philadelphia jury ruling because Sig Sauer, in one of its many sort of liability cases going on around the country, was actually a jury awarded a $11 million verdict over an alleged defect in Sig Sauer's handgun products. Yeah, and the P320, this has been an ongoing issue for Sig for a long time. That started with drop safety issues with the gun. I will say I'm usually extremely skeptical of claims, and I still am, even with the P320, of claims that a gun just went off on its own, especially in a holster. This case, it seemed to
that was the claim, but also there was a claim that the holster didn't cover the trigger, which makes me feel like, that's interesting. So did something get in there and pull the trigger then if the trigger wasn't actually covered by the holster? Because that's a common way that people will shoot themselves when they have a holstered gun, is if their holster is just not safe. But also the P320 has had a reputation for drop safety issues. When it was first sold. And so there's a lot of lawsuits around this gun. And this, I believe, is the first one to see a jury award a major settlement over claims that the gun fired without the trigger being pulled. Although I will say, like, the drop safety issues, if you go back and watch some of the videos of people recreating it, the trigger is pulled. It's just pulled by gravity is the problem with those initial runs of the P320, because it has a different mechanism than like Glock, for instance, where pulling trigger actually finishes cocking the firing pin or the striker in a Glock, whereas most other guns don't have that mechanism. And then also Glock has your typical little triangle pizza thing that keeps the trigger from being pulled unless you put pressure in the right spot. But that the 320 doesn't use that. They use different internal safeties that have come under scrutiny and face criticism. But I don't know. One of the key takeaways, though, I think from this, since this gets brought up in the political context a lot, is that gun makers are not, as President Biden has claimed in the past, totally immune from lawsuits. This is a perfect example of that. The claim here is that there's a defect in the 320, whether that's, I wasn't on the jury. I didn't see all the evidence in this case. So, whether that's true or not is still a bit unclear to me. There's obviously been issues that are demonstrable for the older model P320s. I don't know that every single claim of that gun going off by itself is actually true. Like I said, I'm skeptical of ones where people claim the gun just goes off. But of course, this is a mass product. There will be also ones that are just have defects in them in addition to any potential design problems. But regardless, you can sue SIG over something like this. If you believe there's a design defect and you think you can prove it in court, you can sue them over that. They're not protected by the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act. They don't have liability from suits like this, from product negligence suits like this. And so I just thought that was another key point to make here. Like, you can sue gun companies. Remington's been sued over the design of the trigger on the Remington 700. Taurus, I believe, there's pretty much every gun company has been sued at one point or another. And several of them have been found liable, like in this case. So, there isn't a blanket immunity. The PLCAA only applies to very specific kind of lawsuits, which we also talk a lot about, right? Where the plaintiff is trying to hold a gun company accountable for the criminal acts of a third party that they weren't directly involved with. So, someone uses a Smith & Wesson to shoot somebody else without any involvement from Smith & Wesson itself. You can't sue Smith & Wesson over that.
Right.
But
no, it's
you
a good
can
point.
sue them if they make it a faulty gun, though.
Right. That's a good point. And in fact, like you said, these verdicts do happen, and it's not the blanket immunity that is sometimes purported to be in political discourse.
Yeah. And to be clear, I carry a P365X macro and I have a P320X5. I don't know that these problems persist across the SIGs lineup. But I also am increasingly unhappy with how the industry sort of dumps beta products on the market. That's something I've complained about before, right? With a lot of these these guns they'll put out and you don't really want to buy the first run. I've bought a first run P365 and it had problems, not safety issues, but it had, significant issues with light primer strikes, for instance, which is not good on a gun you want to carry for self-defense. Right? So
Right.
if you have a light primer strike in a self-defense situation, that's a bad day for you. But, there's been all kinds of products that come out on the market with a lot of hype, and then there's some problem with them. They're not fully baked. The Daniel Defense H9, I think, had a lot of issues. There's been so many from so many companies that it's almost like the video game industry, but with guns, which seems much worse.
Yeah, it seems not ideal.
And what you use it for. But anyway, yeah.
Speaking of gun sales and the gun industry, one of our other links has to do with sort of this unique situation that's been going on in Washington. It's apparently resolved now, but for about 2 weeks of this month, the first 2 weeks of this month, their entire background check system was down because of a cyber attack. Their judicial department was cyber attacked, and that includes the state agency that conducts their background checks. So for about 2 weeks, people in Washington could not buy any guns.
Yeah. It's a huge problem. Thousands of people are affected, apparently.
Yeah, they said about 700 people a day were affected. So over 2 weeks, that's a lot of people.
Yeah, it's wild that they weren't able to get this back up faster is a problem too. It's back up and running now. So if you're in Washington, I guess you can go and buy a gun and actually get it. And but yeah, that's an unacceptable thing to have happen. People can't exercise their right because the government's background check system isn't working properly. I mean, the only other time I've heard of this happening was COVID, right? When the system was more or less overloaded, although that was the FBI's system instead of this was the state's background check. Some states do their own, run the background checks themselves rather than having the FBI do it. But yeah, big problem. Glad that it's solved, but really not an acceptable outcome for thousands of lawful gun owners in Washington.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last one we want to touch on just briefly is sort of a little bit of a novelty. Stories out of USA Today talking about a new rideshare service that is starting up in a couple of cities in Texas that is specifically about having armed drivers. So it's basically Uber with guns is sort of the billing.
Which I don't know. I don't know about that billing. I mean, I think the fact that Uber and Lyft bar their drivers from being able to carry seems wrong to me, especially because they're driving around to pick up strangers. And
right.
It could be a dangerous situation if they can legally carry. I don't, why Uber and Lyft try and force them not to is beyond me. But that's a bit different than, I mean, they make this sound, I guess you have to have a security license to do the armed driving. I don't know. I mean, like, it just sounds like you're hiring a bodyguard, but like off of Uber. I don't know, man.
It is almost the way they paint it, because they talk about how all of their drivers are either ex-military or ex-law enforcement.
Yeah.
And it does seem like almost more of like an executive protection detail,
right,
but through like an Uber app.
But like, I mean, I don't know. I'd be interested to see how this actually works in practice, because if it's just Uber, but your driver carries a gun, I don't know that's like, I don't know. The implication is that the driver is going to protect you like a bodyguard.
Right.
And I'm not sure if that's what you're really what they're really selling you or not. I don't know. If it is, that's interesting, but I'd imagine it'd be extremely expensive. Right. Compared to other ways of getting around. And you just go and hire a bodyguard company. I don't know. Maybe they'll find some way to bridge that gap, but it is fascinating. It is certainly something like, I don't know, if you need a bodyguard situation or whatever, like, but I don't, they require a security license. I guess that's something for their armed drivers. Which again implies to me that you're really hiring like a security guard for yourself.
Yeah, it does. It does sound like a personal protection person rather than just a driver that happens to be armed in case, something happens.
Because that's the thing. Like, are they just armed because they want to be armed, or are they armed because they're specifically contracted to protect you? That's, I think, the big distinction that'll matter with this sort of thing.
And it'll be interesting to see if there's widespread demand for even a service like this. So it'll be worth following in that sense, I suppose. I mean,
if it's the latter, if there's specifically like a contract that they are there to be your security guard, then that's interesting. If it's something where they have armed drivers and they're just kind of implying that they're your security guard, but there's no actual obligation or contract to that end, that sounds bad to me. Like, it just sounds like a bad idea. But like I said, Uber banning drivers from being able to carry guns for their own self-protection, not necessarily for the protection of their passengers, because that's like a whole nother level of legal liability involved and presumably training needed. But because I don't just want some random guy who drives Uber and as my security guard. Like, if I'm going to have a security guard, I want them to be somebody with security, like some sort of training for that. But I guess we'll see how it plays out. It's certainly an interesting alternative if you want a little more peace of mind, maybe when you take it. But I would, if you're going to get somebody who has the sort of necessary training and there's going to be a contract that actually says they're there to protect you in particular, and not just themselves, that I would imagine is going to be very expensive. But we'll see. Maybe we'll get that. Maybe I'll try it out next time I'm in one of the states that's going to have this.
Yeah, there you go. That'd be fun. We'll dispatch you to do our correspondent, our rideshare correspondent.
There you go. And are you going to be allowed to carry your own gun in these cars? Because that's another thing. I think Uber doesn't allow you.
That's right. Yeah, even passengers aren't supposed to. Yeah.
So I don't know. I'd take it for that if they let me carry. Although, what Uber doesn't know won't hurt them. If that makes any sense. There's a saying for this, right?
Yeah.
Better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6. I don't know. I would not ever advocate anyone breaking Uber terms of service, but I am sure that people do. But either way, hey, if they just allow me to carry my own gun where I'm legally allowed to do that, right? Like licensed and legally allowed to do so, I'd be interested in a service like that. The other stuff, we'll have to see. I'd have to try it out, see what it's like. All right. Well, that's all we've got for this week. I think next week is Thanksgiving, so we're probably not going to do a news update. We will do, though, a Q&A. So if you're a Reload member, make sure you respond to the email for the Q&A. It's one of the perks of membership is you get to be the people who ask the questions for our Q&A episodes. It's obviously post-election time, pre the next administration coming in. So there's a lot of questions I imagine people have on what's coming. We've so looking forward to answering some of those on the podcast next week. But keep an eye on your members' newsletter that comes out on Sunday. If you are a member, if you're not a member, you should head on over to thereload.com and buy a membership today, and you'll be able to ask questions in this next podcast. And then also you'll get access to hundreds of pieces of news and analysis that you won't find anywhere else. And you'll be funding the work that we do here because that's how we are able to operate, is through membership dues. That's why some of our stories, some of our analysis pieces are member exclusives, because we want you to get the benefit of membership. And we also want to be able to keep doing the work that we do here at The Reload. But that's all we've got for this week. We will see you guys again real soon.